Myself Murshida Yasmin, Assistant Professor. I am here to discuss about the arches of food. Arches of food is an anatomical structure which is present in the human anatomy food. So first we'll see why they are called arches. So the one is a segmented structure which can hold up a weight only if it is built in a form of structure. So the arches of food is built up in a form of arch so that it can have a weight distribution equally on the food. The next is the weight will be distributed on where? One is the heel of the foot, the next one is the head of the metatarsal bones. So the weight will be distributed in the behind and front of the foot so that the pressure will be minimized on the nerves and vessels in the soles. As we know, the blood vessels and nerves in the soles are present in the deeper part of our foot. So those structures should not get damaged on the propulsion on the movements of the foot. So that the arches of foot are built so that can be preventing the pressure which are focusing on the nerves and the blood vessels. So the next one is propulsion forward action will be easier. So the human has to move from one place to another so that the task can be achieved. For that, the arches of foot helps us in propulsion. So now coming to the anatomy of the foot divisions. So as we can see in this picture, the foot is majorly divided into three parts. One is hind foot, the next one is mid foot, the other one is forefoot. The hind foot consists of the heel bone and the ankle joint. The mid foot consists of the metatarsal end and the tarsal bones. So the forefoot consists of all the metatarsus and the toe bones like phalanges of the foot. So these are the divisions of the foot. So next coming to the classification of arches of foot. Majorly the arches of foot is classified into two types, longitudinal arches and transverse arches. Longitudinal arches are named so because the arch is present longitudinally to the foot. So the transverse arch is named so because the arch is in the direction of transverse to the foot. Now coming to the sub-classification, the longitudinal arches of foot are divided into two types. The one is medial longitudinal arch, the next one is lateral longitudinal arch. As you can see in this picture, we can clearly see the medial border of the foot is having a medial longitudinal arch. Next, the lateral border of the foot is having a lateral longitudinal arch. So these two are the sub-classification of the medial and lateral longitudinal arches of our foot. So the first is medial longitudinal arch. So medial longitudinal arch is a structure which is higher in nature, higher comparatively to the lateral longitudinal arch. So the medial longitudinal arch is formed by the bones called calcaneum, talus, navicular, three cuneiform bones and the three metatarsal bones. So the first three metatarsal bones comes into play a role in medial longitudinal arch. And the next one is the three cuneiform bones, the medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform and lateral cuneiform. All the three bones will have a role playing in medial longitudinal arch. The next one is the navicular bone. The navicular bone also plays a role in medial longitudinal arch. So the next key bone, otherwise called as keystone of the arch, which is a talus bone. The talus bone is the keystone of the medial longitudinal arch. So the other is the calcaneum, which forms the posterior end of the medial longitudinal arch. So these are the bones which forms the medial longitudinal arch of our foot. So the next is lateral longitudinal arch. So the lateral longitudinal arch in comparison with the medial longitudinal arch is not higher comparatively to medial longitudinal arch. So that it is stated that it is lower than the medial longitudinal arch of our foot. So coming to bones which are forming the lateral longitudinal arch is the calcaneum, similarly to the medial longitudinal arch. The next one is the cuboid bone. The next is the fourth and fifth metatarsal bones. So these are the bones which are playing a role in the lateral longitudinal arch. So the keystone keystone, otherwise called as key bone of the lateral longitudinal arch is cuboid here. But in medial longitudinal arch, the keystone is the talus. So the next is the transverse arches. As we all saw in the previous slides, we stated that there are majorly two divisions of the arches of foot. The one is the longitudinal arch, the next one is the transverse arch. So we saw about the longitudinal arch, the next is the transverse arch. The transverse arch forms only half. It is formed at the basis of the metatarsal bone, cuboid and three cuneiform bone. As you can see in this picture, all the bones, metatarsal bones, are having a basis which plays a role in transverse longitudinal, transverse arches. And the next is the cuneiform bone, medial cuneiform bone. The other one is the cuboid bone at the lateral end. So all these bones forms a transverse arch of our foot. So the next is the subdivision of the transverse arches of the foot. Anterior transverse arch and posterior transverse arch. Anterior transverse arch is formed by heads of the 5 metatarsal bone. The name itself implies which is present in the anterior. So the heads of the 5 metatarsal bones are forming the anterior transverse arch. So coming to posterior transverse arch, which forms this arch. So greater part of the tarsal bones and the basis of the metatarsals are forming the posterior transverse arch of our foot. So this is all about the arches of foot and what are the sub-classification and what are the things, what are the bones which are playing a role in our arches of our foot. Thank you.